Have you ever stopped at a rest area late at night, where the only sound is the hum of your engine and the distant cry of coyotes? What if the silence wasn't just peaceful, but the calm before a storm? Tonight we dive into a chilling true story of a trucker's graveyard shift that turned into a nightmare. Stay with us, you won't believe how this ends. My name is Raymond Havens, and this story is from October 15th, 1993. I was a truck driver working the graveyard shift, hauling freight across the vast emptiness of New Mexico. That night remains etched in my memory. The air was heavy with the scent of desert sage, and the stars hung low, as if you could pluck them from the sky. My old Peterbilt was loaded with electronics, destined for Phoenix. The CB radio occasionally crackled with chatter from other truckers, but for the most part, the night was silent, just the hum of my engine and the tires' steady whine on the asphalt. I was a few miles out from a tiny town called Kazoo, the kind of place you'd pass without a second thought. Driving at night always gave me a sense of peace. The world was asleep, and the road was mine. I couldn't pinpoint it, but a gnawing unease crept into my gut. I had a couple of hours before my next stop, so I decided to pull into a rest area to stretch my legs and maybe grab a quick nap. It was one of those isolated spots with just a few dim streetlights casting long, eerie shadows. I parked my rig, grabbed my thermos of coffee, and stepped into the cool night air. The place was deserted, save for a rusted sedan that looked like it hadn't moved in years. I leaned against my truck, sipping coffee, listening to the distant howl of coyotes, and trying to shake the fatigue. After a few minutes, I decided to walk around to clear my head. As I rounded the back of my truck, I noticed something strange. The trunk of that old sedan was slightly ajar. My curiosity got the better of me, and I walked over. I tugged at the trunk lid, and it opened with a creak. Inside was a pile of old clothes, a few empty beer cans, and something that caught the light, a blood-stained shirt. A chill ran down my spine. This wasn't just an abandoned car. I carefully closed the trunk and stepped back, my heart pounding. I was about to head back to my truck when I heard a sound that froze me in my tracks, a soft, rhythmic scraping, like metal against metal. It came from the direction of the restrooms. A faint light flickered from one of the windows. Against my better judgment, I decided to investigate. Each step felt like a thunderclap in the stillness. Peering through the grimy restroom window, I saw a figure hunched over a workbench, sharpening a large hunting knife under the sickly yellow glow of a single bulb. He was tall and lean, with wild, unkempt hair. His face, focused and intense, looked like a mask of concentration. My heart raced. This wasn't just some drifter, there was something deliberate and sinister about him. I needed to leave. As I turned, my boots scraped against the gravel. The noise echoed like a gunshot. The man's head snapped up, and for a brief moment, our eyes met through the window. I bolted for my truck, hearing the restroom door slam open behind me. I didn't look back. I scrambled into the cab, fumbling with my keys, finally managing to start the engine. As I pulled out of the rest area, I glanced in the rearview mirror. He was standing in the middle of the road, his knife gleaming in the moonlight. I drove like a man possessed, my mind racing with questions. Who was that man? What had he done to warrant a blood-stained shirt in the trunk of that car? I reached the next truck stop without incident, parking in a well-lit area surrounded by other truckers. I called the local sheriff's office, reporting everything I'd seen. The deputy I spoke with assured me they'd check it out. The next morning, 2 deputies approached me at the truck stop diner. "Mr. Havens," one asked. "That's me." I replied, my stomach tightening. "We found the car you mentioned," he said, and signs of a struggle in the restroom blood, broken glass. "The man you saw, we know him. Name's Jack Morgan. He's wanted in connection with several disappearances along the I-25 corridor." My blood ran cold. Disappearances? Mostly drifters and hitchhikers, the deputy said grimly. People who wouldn't be missed right away. "He was gone by the time we got there, but you did the right thing reporting this." I nodded, the weight of their words settling in. Jack Morgan was still out there. Even now, years later, I think about that night every time I pull into a rest area. The unease never fully goes away, and every shadow seems darker, every stranger more menacing. But the scariest part? Knowing he's still out there somewhere. Imagine pulling over on a quiet highway to help someone stranded in the blazing heat, only to realize you've just invited a dangerous secret into your truck. What began as an act of kindness spiraled into a chilling encounter that would change one trucker's life forever. Stick around, this one will keep you on the edge of your seat. My name is Leroy Blackburn, and this happened to me on August 17th, 1998. I was 36 years old then, a truck driver making my way through the back roads of southern Missouri. I was hauling a load of timber from Mark Twain National Forest to a sawmill in Springfield. Trucking is a lonely job, but it pays the bills and keeps you moving, which I like. I remember that day vividly because it was hot. The kind of heat that makes the air shimmer and sweat bead on your forehead just from stepping outside. I had my windows down, hoping for a breeze, but the air was still and thick. I'd been driving since sunrise, trying to make good time before the heat became unbearable. My truck, an old Peterbilt 379, rumbled along the narrow highway, the engine's steady drone almost soothing. I was thinking about pulling over for a break, maybe at the next gas station, when I noticed a car pulled off on the shoulder up ahead. It was an old, beat-up Pontiac with its hood up and steam billowing out. A man stood next to it, waving his arms. Normally I wouldn't stop. You hear too many stories about truckers getting robbed or worse, but something about the way he looked desperate, almost panicked, made me hit the brakes. Maybe it was the heat. Maybe it was a gut feeling. I slowed down and pulled to a stop a few yards ahead of him. "Hey man," he called out as I climbed down from the cab. "Thanks for stopping. My car overheated and I'm stranded. Can you give me a hand?" He looked about my age, maybe a little younger, with shaggy brown hair and a scruffy beard. His shirt was soaked with sweat, and his eyes darted around nervously. "Sure thing," I said. "Got any water in the radiator?" "Yeah, but it's all steamed out. I think there's a leak." I walked over to the front of his car and looked. The radiator cap was off, and it was bone dry. I had some water in the truck, so I went back to get it. As I did, I noticed him glancing up and down the road, like he was expecting someone. "Where you headed?" I asked, trying to make conversation. "Springfield," he replied. "Same as you, I guess. Name's Tommy, by the way, Tommy Garrison." "Leroy," I said, handing him the water jug. "Let's see if we can get you moving again." We spent about 15 minutes pouring water into the radiator and trying to start the car, but the engine was shot. I offered him a ride into Springfield, and he gratefully accepted. He didn't seem like trouble, just a guy down on his luck. Tommy climbed into the passenger seat of my truck, and we got back on the road. He was quiet for a while, staring out the window with his hands trembling slightly. I figured it was just nerves from being stranded. You in some kind of trouble. I finally asked, keeping my tone casual. Tommy glanced at me, his eyes wide. Why do you ask? You seem jumpy, that's all? If you're running from someone, I'd rather know about it. He sighed and ran a hand through his damp hair. It's complicated. I'm not in trouble exactly, but there are some guys looking for me. I owe them money. Loan sharks. Oh, something like that. I decided not to press for details. In my years on the road, I'd learned when to ask questions and when to let things go. We drove in silence, the miles ticking by. I started to think I might have made a mistake picking him up. When we came to a little diner on the outskirts of a small town, I decided to stop. You hungry? I asked. I could use a bite to eat. Tommy nodded, looking relieved. We pulled into the diner's parking lot and climbed out of the truck. The place was nearly empty, just a couple of locals sipping coffee at the counter. We found a booth in the back and ordered burgers and fries. As we waited for our food, Tommy started to relax a bit. He even smiled when the waitress brought our drinks. I thought maybe things were looking up. But then the door opened and two men walked in. They were big, rough-looking types with hard eyes and mean expressions. Tommy's face went pale. That's them, he whispered. We need to get out of here. But it was too late. The men spotted us and started walking over. I could see the fear in Tommy's eyes. For a moment, I considered making a run for it, but where would we go? They'd just follow us. Afternoon, gents, I said as they approached. Can I help you with something? The bigger of the two, a bald guy with a scar across his cheek, sneered. This ain't your business, trucker. We're here for him. He jabbed a thumb in Tommy's direction. I stood up, trying to make myself look bigger than I was. Maybe it's not my business, but he's with me. You got a problem with him, you got a problem with me. The scarred man laughed, a harsh, grating sound. You've got guts, trucker, but you're outnumbered. We're not leaving without him. Tommy grabbed my arm. Leroy, please, let's just go. I couldn't back down, not now. Not with them looking at me like that. Fine, I said, stepping aside. Take him. But if he's not in one piece when you leave, you'll regret it. The scarred man grinned and grabbed Tommy by the collar, dragging him out of the booth. I followed them outside, not sure what I was going to do, but knowing I couldn't just let them take him. As soon as we were out the door, Tommy broke free and took off running. The two men swore and chased after him. I hesitated, then ran after them. We didn't get far. Tommy was fast, but the men were faster. They caught him at the edge of the parking lot and tackled him to the ground. I saw the glint of a knife. Without thinking, I charged at them, knocking one off Tommy. The other swung his knife at me wildly, cutting my side. I ignored the pain and kept fighting, landing a punch that sent him stumbling. Run, I shouted to Tommy. He hesitated, then sprinted toward the truck. I tried to follow, but the pain in my side was too much. The two men ran back to their car, shouting and swearing, before peeling out of the lot. Only then did I let myself collapse. When I woke up, I was in a hospital bed. The nurse told me I'd been found by some locals who called an ambulance. My wound wasn't life-threatening, but Tommy wasn't so lucky. The police told me they'd found his body in a ditch miles away. I tried to help him, but I failed. It's a hard thing to live with. Even now, every time I see someone on the side of the road, I think about that day. And I keep driving. Have you ever felt safe on a quiet stretch of highway, only to realize you're being watched? One trucker's routine drive through northern Michigan turned into a chilling game of survival. What began with an unsettling tailgater spiraled into an unforgettable confrontation. Stick around, this is one story you won't want to miss. My name is Vernon Gage, and this all happened to me on August 16th, 2005. I'm a truck driver by trade, hauling freight across the United States. It's not a glamorous job, but it pays the bills and gives me plenty of time to think while I'm on the road. That day, I was driving through northern Michigan, a route I'd taken dozens of times before. I was hauling a load of lumber from the Upper Peninsula down to a small town called Petoskey. The sun was setting, and the sky had that pinkish-orange hue that made everything seem peaceful. I made a quick pit stop at a small diner off US 31. It was a cozy, almost forgotten place called Dolly's Diner, the kind of spot that probably hadn't changed since the 1950s. It had checkered floors and a jukebox that still played Elvis. I grabbed a coffee and a piece of pie and chatted with Dolly herself. She was a sprightly old woman with a quick wit. She joked about how truckers like me kept her in business. We laughed, and I promised I'd stop by more often. It was a brief moment of normalcy, something that made what happened later feel even more surreal. I hit the road again as night fell, my headlights cutting through the growing darkness. The road was quiet, with only the occasional car passing by. I always found night drives comforting, the hum of the engine, the steady rhythm of the tires on asphalt, the solitude. But that night, something felt different. About an hour out from Petoskey, I noticed a car tailing me. At first, I didn't think much of it. Maybe it was another driver trying to make up time. But the car stayed behind me for miles, matching my speed and moves. I slowed down, hoping it would pass, but it just stayed there. When I sped up, it did too. My nerves began to fray. I decided to pull over at a rest stop, thinking they'd move on once I stopped. But the car pulled in right behind me. No one got out. I watched in my rearview mirror for a few minutes, then decided to confront whoever it was. Maybe it was just some kids messing around. I grabbed my flashlight from the glove compartment and stepped out of the cab. As I approached the car, I could see two people inside, but they were just silhouettes. I knocked on the driver's window, trying to keep my cool. "Hey, you got a problem?" I said, my voice steady. The window rolled down slowly, revealing a man in his 40s with a scruffy beard and hollow eyes. He didn't say a word, just stared at me with unsettling intensity. The passenger, a woman, looked just as disheveled. Her eyes were wide and darting around like a cornered animal. "Can I help you?" I asked again, this time with more edge in my tone. The man finally spoke. His voice was low and gravelly. "We need help. Our car broke down back there, and we just need a ride." Something about the way he said it didn't sit right with me. His tone was too calm, too rehearsed. It was dark, and maybe they really did need help. Against my better judgment, I told them to wait while I grabbed my phone from the truck to call for assistance. As I turned to walk back, I heard the car door open. I spun around, and the man was out, moving toward me faster than I expected. In his hand, glinting under the dim lights of the rest stop, was a knife. Instinct kicked in. I backed up quickly, raising my flashlight like a club. "Stay back," I yelled, trying to keep my voice steady. He didn't stop. He lunged. I swung the flashlight, catching him on the arm. He grunted but didn't drop the knife. Panic surged through me as I realized this wasn't a random act of desperation. The woman got out of the car then, holding something a length of rope. This was planned. It was coordinated. I bolted for my truck. The man grabbed my jacket, yanking me back. I twisted free, leaving the jacket behind, and scrambled up into the cab, slamming the door shut just as he reached it. He pounded on the window, the knife scraping against the glass. My hand shook as I fumbled for my phone, finally managing to dial 911. 911. What's your emergency? I'm at a rest stop office 31 near Petoskey. I gasped. 2 people are trying to attack me. One's got a knife. Stay on the line, sir. Help is on the way. The dispatcher said, her calm voice a lifeline. The man outside seemed to realize I was calling for help. He shouted something to the woman, and they both ran back to their car. Moments later, they sped off, their tires screeching. Minutes felt like hours, but finally, a sheriff's cruiser pulled in. Deputy Miller, a burly man with a calm demeanor, took my statement while his partner searched the area. "You did the right thing calling us," Miller said, his voice reassuring. "We'll find these people." The deputies escorted me to Petoskey, ensuring I reached my delivery safely. I spent the night at a cheap motel, my mind racing. Sleep was impossible. The next day, I finished my delivery and stopped by Dolly's diner again, needing some semblance of normalcy. Dolly noticed I was shaken and poured me a coffee on the house. "You all right, Vernon?" she asked, her concern genuine. I told her what had happened. She shook her head, her face grim. "This world's gone crazy. You be careful out there." Weeks passed, and I tried to put the incident behind me, but it wasn't over. A few months later, I got a call from Deputy Miller. They'd found the car abandoned in a wooded area not far from the rest stop. Inside, they discovered evidence linking the pair to a series of robberies and assaults along the highways. Miller told me the man and woman Frank and Laura Benson had a long history of violence and theft. They'd been targeting truckers, seeing us as easy marks. "They're dangerous, Vernon," Miller said. "If you see them again, don't hesitate to call." I thanked him and hung up, a chill running down my spine. Months turned into years, but the memory of that night never faded. Every shadow on the road felt like a threat, every stranger a potential danger. The open road, once my solace, now held a shadow of fear. Have you ever stopped at a rest area in the middle of nowhere, thinking it would be just another quiet night? One trucker did, and what he discovered turned into a fight for survival. This is the chilling story of how a late-night break on Nevada's loneliest road became a night he would never forget. My name is Darby Montague, and this happened to me in May of 1998. I was hauling a load of refrigerated meat across a desolate stretch of highway in Nevada, bound for a distribution center in Sacramento. It was the kind of route where you could drive for hours without seeing another soul, just miles of scrubland and the occasional tumbleweed rolling across the road. The monotony was enough to make anyone go a bit stir-crazy, but the pay was decent, and I had bills to pay. It was around midnight when I pulled into a rest area off Highway 50, also known as the loneliest road in America. I needed a break, and the eerie quiet of the place seemed as good a spot as any. There were a few other trucks parked there, their engines idling softly in the darkness, no doubt with their drivers catching some shut-eye. I climbed down from my cab, stretched my legs, and headed toward the restrooms. The air was cool, and the only sound was the distant hum of a generator somewhere in the lot. I noticed a beat-up sedan parked at the far end of the lot, its windows too dark to see inside. I didn't think much of it at the time. Folks in all kinds of vehicles use these rest stops. As I was washing my hands in the grimy restroom, the door creaked open behind me. In the mirror, I saw a man step inside. He was tall, maybe 6'8", with a thick beard and wearing a ratty flannel shirt. He didn't make eye contact, just shuffled over to the urinals. Something about him set me on edge, but I shrugged it off, dried my hands, and headed back to my truck. When I got back to my rig, I saw another trucker I knew, Vince, standing by his truck, smoking a cigarette. Vince was a burly guy with a friendly demeanor. We chatted for a bit about our routes and the usual trucker gripes. "Hey, Darby. Vince said, taking a drag of his smoke. "You ever get the feeling like you're being watched out here?" I chuckled. "All the time, man. Probably just the isolation getting to you." Vince nodded but didn't look convinced. "Yeah, maybe. Anyway, stay safe out there." We said our goodbyes, and I climbed back into my cab, locking the doors out of habit. I reclined my seat, closed my eyes, and tried to get some rest. But sleep didn't come easy. The image of that bearded guy in the restroom kept popping into my head. A few hours later, I was jolted awake by a loud banging on my driver's side door. My heart leapt into my throat as I grabbed the tire iron I kept under my seat and cautiously peered out the window. It was Vince, and he looked panicked. "Darby, open up. We've got trouble." I unlocked the door, and Vince practically fell inside, gasping for breath. "What's going on?" I asked, my voice tinged with alarm. "It's Randy," Vince said between breaths. "You know the guy driving the blue Kenworth? I found him behind the restrooms. He's dead, man. Someone slit his throat." A cold chill ran through me. Randy was another regular on this route, a quiet guy who mostly kept to himself. I couldn't believe it. "Did you call the cops?" "There's no signal out here," Vince replied, his hands shaking. "We need to get out of here and find a phone." I nodded, started the engine, and pulled out of the rest area with Vince riding shotgun. We drove in silence, both of us on high alert. After what felt like an eternity, we found a diner with a payphone about 30 miles down the road. I called 911 and reported the murder, giving them the location and as many details as I could remember. The police arrived quickly, considering how remote the area was. They took our statements and told us to stay put while they investigated. But neither Vince nor I wanted to hang around. We both had a bad feeling about the whole thing. We decided to convoy the rest of the way to Sacramento, figuring there was safety in numbers. As we rolled out, I couldn't help but glance in my mirrors constantly, half expecting to see that bearded man following us. The sun was just starting to rise, casting long shadows across the desert, but it did little to ease my nerves. A few hours later, we pulled into the distribution center in Sacramento. Exhausted but relieved to be off the road, we checked in, unloaded our cargo, and headed to a nearby truck stop for some much-needed rest. As we sat in the diner, nursing cups of bad coffee, we talked about what had happened. "Do you think it was that guy in the restroom?" Vince asked, his eyes darting around the room as if the killer might appear at any moment. "Maybe," I said, stirring my coffee absent-mindedly. He gave me the creeps, but I didn't get a good look at him. Well, whoever it was, they knew what they were doing. Vince said grimly. Randy never had a chance. The next few days were a blur of police interviews and restless nights. The authorities were tight-lipped about their investigation, but word got around that they had no leads and no suspects. Truckers started to avoid that stretch of Highway 50, and those who had no choice but to drive it did so with a heightened sense of vigilance. I couldn't stop thinking about Randy and that bearded man. Every time I pulled into a rest area or truck stop, I found myself scanning the faces around me, looking for anything out of the ordinary. The sense of camaraderie among us truckers grew stronger than ever, but so did the underlying current of fear. A week after the murder, I was back on the road, hauling a load of electronics to Salt Lake City. I had just passed through Ely, Nevada, and was heading into another long stretch of desolate highway when I noticed a familiar beat-up sedan in my rearview mirror. It was the same one I'd seen at the rest area the night Randy was killed. My pulse quickened as I kept an eye on the car. It followed me for miles, never getting too close but never falling too far behind either. I knew I had to do something, but with no cell signal and no other vehicles in sight, my options were limited. I decided to take the next exit, a barely marked dirt road that led to an old mining town. I figured if the car followed me, at least I'd have confirmation that it wasn't a coincidence. Sure enough, the sedan took the exit right after me. My heart pounded as I navigated the rough road, dust kicking up behind my rig. The road wound through a narrow canyon, and I knew I couldn't keep this up forever. I needed to confront whoever was in that car, but I had to be smart about it. Up ahead, I spotted a wide spot in the road where I could pull over. I parked my truck and climbed out, tire iron in hand, ready for whatever came next. The sedan pulled up about 50 feet behind me and stopped. The driver didn't get out, just sat there with the engine running. I took a deep breath and walked toward the car, my grip tightening on the tire iron. "Hey," I shouted. "What do you want?" There was no response. The driver's window rolled down slowly, and out stepped the bearded man from the restroom. He didn't say a word, just started walking toward me with a cold, menacing look in his eyes. I raised the tire iron, ready to defend myself, but before I could react, he lunged at me with a knife. We struggled, and I managed to knock the blade from his hand, but he was strong, and I was quickly losing ground. I swung the tire iron again, connecting with his shoulder, but it barely seemed to faze him. In the chaos, I heard the distant sound of an engine approaching. Another truck appeared at the top of the canyon. It was Vince. The bearded man, realizing he was outnumbered, made a run for his sedan. He jumped in and sped off, leaving a trail of dust behind him. Vince pulled up beside me, his face a mix of concern and relief. "You okay, Darby?" he shouted. I nodded, breathing heavily. "Yeah. Thanks to you." We reported the incident to the police, who launched a manhunt for the bearded man. Despite their efforts, he was never caught. The attack left me with a deep scar, both physical and mental. I eventually moved on to a different route, hoping to leave the fear behind, but the memory of that night stayed with me. Picture this: you're on a dark, winding road with no cell service and no signs of life for miles. What starts as a routine delivery turns into a terrifying encounter with a knife-wielding stranger. This is one trucker's harrowing tale of survival on the back roads of West Virginia. Stay tuned, it's a ride you won't forget. My name is Dean Kilgore, and this happened to me on August 12, 2005. I was a long-haul truck driver, logging thousands of miles every week, delivering everything from electronics to produce. The job kept me on the road more than at home, but I didn't mind. The solitude and the steady hum of the highway were comforting. I had a small house back in Tucumcari, New Mexico, but I was rarely there. Most of my time was spent in the cab of my Freightliner, a trusty partner on my cross-country treks. That particular day, I was hauling a load of refrigerators to a small town in West Virginia. It was so small, it didn't even show up on some maps. My route took me through miles of back roads, winding through dense forests and forgotten towns. I enjoyed the change from endless stretches of interstate highways, but something about this route felt off. It was too quiet, too isolated. I had my CB radio on for company, but the airwaves were silent, no chatter from other truckers, no traffic updates, nothing but static. I checked my watch. The sun was dipping below the horizon, casting long shadows over the road. I figured I'd pull over soon to find a rest area and get some shut-eye. That's when I saw a sign for a diner up ahead. It promised hot food and truck parking, and I decided to stop. The diner looked like something out of a movie. It had old-school charm, with flickering neon lights above the entrance. I parked my rig and went inside. The place was nearly empty, just a couple of locals nursing coffee at the counter. The waitress, a middle-aged woman with a tired smile, handed me a menu. I ordered a burger and fries, figuring I'd treat myself after a long day on the road. While I waited for my food, I struck up a conversation with a guy at the counter. His name was Earl, a local farmer. We talked about the weather and his crops, just small talk. Then, Earl mentioned something that caught my attention. "There's been some strange things happening around here lately," he said. "People going missing. Odd sightings in the woods." I shrugged it off, chalking it up to local superstition. Every small town has its ghost stories. My food arrived, and I dug in. The burger was greasy and delicious, just what I needed. I finished up, paid my bill, and headed back to my truck. The parking lot was empty, except for a couple of other rigs, their drivers likely asleep in their cabs. I climbed into my truck, locked the doors, and settled in for the night. I must have dozed off quickly, because the next thing I knew, I was jolted awake by a loud bang. I sat up, heart pounding, trying to figure out what had happened. Another bang, this time from the back of the truck. Someone was out there, messing with my rig. I grabbed a flashlight and cautiously opened the door. The night was pitch black, and the air was thick with the scent of pine. I shone the flashlight around but saw nothing. just the empty parking lot and the shadows of the surrounding trees. I checked the trailer and the cab, everything seemed fine. Maybe it was just an animal. I locked up again and tried to go back to sleep, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. My gut told me to leave, but I ignored it. I was too tired to drive and figured I was just being paranoid. A few hours later, I woke up again. This time I heard a strange scraping sound. It was coming from the back of the trailer. I grabbed my flashlight and a tire iron and cautiously made my way outside. The night was eerily silent. The only sound was my footsteps on the gravel. I rounded the back of the trailer and saw something that made my blood run cold. There was a man crouched down by the rear doors, prying them open with a crowbar. He was tall and lanky, dressed in dark clothes that blended into the night. His face was obscured by a baseball cap pulled low over his eyes. When he saw my flashlight, he looked up. For a moment, we just stared at each other. "Hey, what the hell are you doing?" I shouted, gripping the tire iron tightly. The man didn't respond. He just stood there, staring at me with an intensity that made my skin crawl. Then, without a word, he turned and bolted into the woods, disappearing into the darkness. I debated whether to chase after him, but something told me that was a bad idea. Instead, I checked the trailer doors. They were damaged but still locked. I decided it was time to leave. I jumped into the cab, started the engine, and pulled out of the parking lot as fast as I could. My heart was racing and my hands were shaking. I drove for a few miles, trying to put some distance between me and that diner. Then I found a truck stop well lit and busy and parked there for the rest of the night. I didn't sleep much. I kept hearing that scraping sound in my head. The next morning I called the local sheriff's office and reported what had happened. They took my statement and said they'd look into it, but I could tell they didn't think it was a big deal, just some local troublemaker probably. I continued on my route, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Every time I stopped, I was on high alert, scanning the area for anything out of place. A few days later, I finished my delivery and headed back home to New Mexico. I tried to put the whole thing behind me, but it kept gnawing at me. I did some digging online, looking for any news from that small town in West Virginia. What I found was chilling. There had been several reports of people going missing in the area, and a few bodies had turned up in the woods mutilated and unrecognizable. The descriptions matched what Earl had told me in the diner. I couldn't help but wonder if the man I saw was connected to those disappearances. The thought made my blood run cold. I couldn't stop thinking about it, replaying the events of that night over and over in my head. I even went back to the diner a few months later, hoping to get some answers. But the place was closed, boarded up like it had been abandoned for years. I asked around and found out it had been shut down shortly after my visit. The locals were tight-lipped and didn't want to talk about what had happened. I didn't press them. Figured I'd be better off not knowing. But the nightmares didn't stop. Every night, I dreamed of that man, his cold, empty eyes staring at me. I'd wake up in a cold sweat, my heart pounding. I tried to convince myself it was just my imagination, but deep down I knew better. Something was out there. Something evil. Imagine driving through a quiet Oregon forest, expecting nothing more than a peaceful haul. Then, out of nowhere, You're ambushed by strangers who seem to know the woods far too well. What starts as a routine trip spirals into a dangerous encounter. Stay with us as we tell the story of a trucker's harrowing night that he barely survived. My name is Cyrus Hale, and this happened to me on July 14th, 1992. Back then, I was a truck driver hauling goods across the country for a small freight company. That day, I was driving through the back roads of Oregon, a place called Wallowa County. The area was remote, surrounded by thick forests and rugged mountains. It was just me, the road, and my old Peterbilt truck. I had been driving for about 6 hours and decided to pull over at a small rest area near a town called Enterprise. There wasn't much to the place, just a single gas pump, a rundown diner called Mabel's, and an old, faded sign that read, "Welcome to Enterprise." I needed a break, some coffee, and maybe a bite to eat. My buddy Ted had told me about Mabel's famous apple pie, so I figured I'd give it a try. The diner was like stepping back in time. The walls were lined with old photographs, the kind that told stories of the past. The smell of bacon and coffee filled the air. I sat at the counter, ordered a coffee and a slice of pie, and got to talking with the waitress, a middle-aged woman named Sarah. "You're a long way from home, aren't you?" she asked with a smile, pouring my coffee. "Yeah, just passing through," I replied. "I heard the pie here's worth the trip." She laughed. "Mabel's pie is the best in the state. You won't be disappointed." As I enjoyed my coffee and pie, a couple of locals walked in. One was a tall, wiry guy with a scruffy beard. He looked like he'd seen better days. The other was shorter and stockier, wearing a baseball cap. They nodded in my direction and sat down at a nearby table. The taller guy looked over at me. "New in town. Just passing through," I said. "Name's Cyrus." "I'm Roy," he replied, extending a calloused hand. "This here's Dave." We chatted for a bit. They told me they were loggers and warned me about the mountain roads, saying they could be tricky, especially at night. I thanked them for the advice, finished my pie, and left a tip for Sarah. As I headed back to my truck, I noticed an old Ford pickup parked next to it. The bed of the truck was filled with logging equipment, chainsaws, and axes. Something about it gave me an uneasy feeling, but I shrugged it off. I had miles to cover and deadlines to meet. Back on the road, the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the forest. The radio played some classic rock, and I was feeling pretty good. Then, about an hour later, my CB radio crackled to life. "Breaker 19, this is Lone Wolf. Anyone out there?" It was Roy's voice. I grabbed the mic. "This is Big Rig." "Go ahead, Lone Wolf." "Hey Cyrus, just wanted to let you know there's been some trouble up ahead. A logging truck overturned, blocking the road. You might want to take the detour." "Copy that, Lone Wolf. Thanks for the heads up." I checked the map and saw a narrow road that veered off to the right, leading through the mountains. It was a longer route, but it seemed like the only option. I took the detour. The road wound through dense forest, the trees closing in on both sides. After about half an hour, the road narrowed even more, barely wide enough for my rig. It was getting darker, and my headlights barely pierced the thick fog that had settled in. The CB crackled again. "Big Rig, you there?" "Yeah, go ahead." Be careful out there. Strange things happen in these woods. What kind of strange things? I asked. But there was no response, just static. I kept driving, my eyes scanning the road ahead. Suddenly I saw a figure standing in the middle of the road. I hit the brakes, and the truck screeched to a halt, stopping just a few feet from him. It was a man waving his arms frantically. "Help. Please help me," he shouted. I grabbed my flashlight and climbed down from the cab. The man was in his late 20s, his clothes torn and dirty, his face pale with fear. "What's going on?" I asked, gripping the flashlight tightly. "My friend," he said. "He's hurt. We were hiking, and he fell. I need help." "Where is he?" "Not far, just off the road." Against my better judgment, I followed him into the woods, my flashlight cutting through the darkness. We walked for about 10 minutes before we reached a small clearing. There was a campsite, a tent, and a fire that had burned down to embers, but there was no one else there. "Where's your friend?" I asked, turning to face him. He didn't answer. Instead, he pulled out a knife. The blade glinted in the flashlight's beam. My heart raced. I backed away, but he lunged at me, slashing wildly. I managed to dodge the first few swings, but he was fast and determined. I swung the flashlight, hitting him in the face. He stumbled back, giving me a moment to reach into my pocket and pull out my folding knife. We circled each other, the tension thick in the air. "Why are you doing this?" I demanded. He didn't answer. He just laughed a cold, hollow sound and charged at me again. I sidestepped and slashed his arm, causing him to drop his knife. He screamed in pain, clutching his bleeding arm. "Who are you?" I shouted, my voice echoing through the trees. He didn't respond. Another man emerged from the bushes, his face hidden in the shadows. He was holding a rifle aimed straight at me. "Let him go," the man with the rifle ordered. I had no choice. I released my grip on the guy beneath me and slowly stood up, my hands raised. The man with the rifle motioned for his friend to get up. "Get his wallet," he said. The guy I had tackled rummaged through my pockets, pulled out my wallet, and tossed it to the man with the rifle. He flipped through it, then threw it on the ground. "Let's go," he said. They disappeared into the woods, leaving me standing there, shaken and confused. I picked up my wallet, checked that everything was still there, and hurried back to my truck. I tried radioing Roy, but there was no response. I drove through the night, my mind racing with questions. Who were those men? What did they want? And why did they let me go? When I finally reached the next town, I reported the incident to the local sheriff. He took my statement, but didn't seem to believe me. He said they'd look into it, but I knew it was a dead end. I kept driving, trying to put the whole ordeal behind me. But it haunted me, the memory of that night and the fear in those men's eyes. Years later, I heard about a series of disappearances in Wallowa County. Hikers, campers, even a few truck drivers had gone missing. Their bodies were never found. It sent chills down my spine, knowing how close I had come to becoming one of them. To this day, I can't drive through Oregon without thinking about that night.